And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, like heaven above me, the spy who loved me.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I should sing Secret Agent Man.
Okay.
Lou Elizondo came out of obscurity once again. And this time he claims that apparently there are threats against him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and he went into this whole thing about how I am not suicidal and all this kind of thing. Look, and whenever someone talks about threats or suicide, I always take them seriously anyway. But, with Elizondo having a book coming out later this fall, this seems to me the new edge of the op, as it were. One of the reasons I say that is someone who backed him up online was this Marieke von Remetkopf. And Marieke is a writer for The Hill now, but used to be in the Obama State Department. And what I've noticed about this Marieke character is they go around pumping up, fanning the flames of the UAP thing and using the government threat, UFO government threat bit. So here's von Remetkopf saying, I do not post this lightly, which is what Elizondo said. I have been made aware of specific credible threats against Louis Elizondo. Oh, Lou, standing up for humanity. Oh, wait a minute, you work for the CIA. At this time, I'm unaware of any specific credible threats against other confirmed or prospective UAP whistleblowers. Yeah, this is a big problem because who are they prospective to? It's pretty interesting because in Elizondo's post, one of the things that he put up there, and I thought this was strange, which was he included himself first, and then he was like, oh, and all these other UAP whistleblowers are also being targeted. Look, this is a kind of, it's a caricature of the actual thing because, of course, a real UFO whistleblower does have to deal with threats, does have to deal with pressure, and the whole deep structure of Exprotech that we've talked about. But Elizondo's somebody who's worked in intelligence circles for 30 years, worked directly for the CIA. And, so this is somebody who's good at been playing these games, as it were. Now, I was thinking with the whole Grush rollout thing at first, they might be thinking, we can cart away with Lou. That didn't work out so well. So he might be trying to get himself back on the radar with this. But the whole UFO threat game, I have a feeling from everything that I'm reading that in June and July, you're going to see some moves here. And again, they're trying to motivate through Congress, and they're trying to motivate this whole UFO threat piece. That's something that we're going to keep an eye on. But I couldn't help but think Lou is back to deliver even more LARPiness. And tonight's show, of course, is nothing about even the UFO file. Tonight is all about Atlantis Anno 0. And this is Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group. This is a very interesting piece I'm going to bring out about Blavatsky and her Thevetat characterization of these sorcerers in Atlantis and how that lines up so well with what Casey was putting together about Belial and how all of this information ended up right in the heart of the American century there at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And right along with it was a very interesting character named Eldridge Johnson. We're going to get into all the interesting things that happened there and the sudden appearance of the figure of Thomas Townsend Brown right in the heart of all this. And really, we put out this major documentary called Hacking Atlantis, the CRAZE and the HOTZONE on May 3rd. And so the show that we did last week was more kind of an overview and a supplement to that documentary. And this is kind of the third piece. So you can really take all three of these together because they're one whole piece about the hot zone and the mystery school involvement along with the geopolitical aspect moved together directly there in that fascinating area, which touches on the coast of Florida, the Bahamas, Bimini, and the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba. So we've got a very interesting breakthrough happening here, which is all this information. Of course, I've been on the Hot Zone trail for a number of years, and we've been bringing out more and more about it. We started very deep with the Ernest Hemingway material, even found the involvement of JFK in transporting a lot of this information out of the Hot Zone and back to America through Hemingway. And Hemingway's links with Edgar Cayce, and Cayce talking about the Poseidon Temple rising off the coast of Bimini and predicting some of it would be discovered in 1968. And that is what we know as the Bimini Wall. There were a lot of interesting things in the documentary, of course, about the involvement of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein in the Hot Zone with some of the most major scientists of the day, including Stephen Hawking and others. Of course, he went down there in a submarine called Atlantis. But along the way in that documentary, we found out about Alexandra Cousteau and how she was targeted by Maxwell, and also how Marvin Minsky was in the heart of this. And so much of that came out through the Virginia Giuffre testimony and in other places as well. So we got a real break there. And the question that I posed with all of it was, why would these groups like Maxwell and Epstein be targeting people like Alexandra Cousteau, who runs an ocean, she runs an ocean nonprofit now, but of course her grandfather is kind of the godfather, the late godfather of Atlantis research, Jacques Cousteau. And he did every kind of documentary or special, sort of Finding Atlantis, the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau. And if anyone knew, with all of his underwater expertise, if anyone knew anything about ruins down there in the Hot Zone, it was Cousteau. And obviously that's why they were targeting Alexandra, his granddaughter. So there's a few unusual things there. Of course, Cousteau's son died in a very strange plane crash off of Spain. And I don't know if that's related to this research or not, but it certainly was very troubling to look at. The other thing that was interesting about all of this is the presence of Minsky, because Minsky is the father of AI, and he passed away around 2014 or so. But one of the things we brought forward, and one of the reasons they may have involved him, is that his very best friend in the world was Margaret Adams. And Margaret Adams was her married name. Her maiden name was Margaret Sanders, and she was the daughter of Colonel Sanders. And so we did an episode, The Colonel in the Hot Zone, but I've included this as the kind of tapestry on this other side. So we have these major kind of mystery school moves and the broader understanding, say, from Plato and Ignatius Donnelly about Atlantis. Then you have this other thing, which is somehow there's a group involved, and I've been referring to it as this Hot Zone network, and they've been trying to penetrate into these ruins into the Bahamas. And there's another group which is also trying to get their hands on this. And so you have a kind of an X Protect, X Share vibe going on again. And just like with the UFO file, somehow T.T. Brown was one of the key people involved. And I'm going to get into how as we get along here tonight. This is Atlantis Anno Zero, Year Zero, Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group, along with Alice in Wonderland and Thomas Townsend Brown in the Hot Zone. This is a power-packed X-Series episode for 170. We're going to go a couple hours with you here tonight, and in the second half of the program, we'll take your questions. Before I go any further, I'm going to ask Miss Olivia what the temperature is tonight.
It's great. Can you spell Thevetat?
Yes. There's a few different spellings, and this is the interesting thing. So you've got Thevetat. Now
wait,
that's
Thev.
Thev, and then you've got Etat.
Okay.
And what's interesting is this Thevetat may have survived in legend as the enemy of Buddha in Indian tradition. And this is quite fascinating. Devadatta is what they call him. But Blavatsky, in the Songs of Zion in the Secret Doctrine, just an incredible piece sitting there in this work, which even her contemporaries and after the fact, people like Steiner would look back on this and say, "Wow, that book contains such truths." And so everyone was very impressed with it. And right in the heart of it is this piece about these incredible Atlantean sorcerers. But she refers to Thevetat in a particular way that I want to get at tonight, because I think we can open up the larger question about some of the occult sorcery aspects involved in all of this and why that's a major kind of explosive piece. Casey's referring to it with the Belial group, saying that they had created, basically half of the continent of Atlantis as this kind of black magic center. And we also have them misusing the two-eye stone, which may be the crux of so much of the kind of geopolitical moves around the hot zone. And of course, we have Steiner referring to the Armonic black magicians of Atlantis and how they had moved in post Atlantean downfall into the Mayan area and try to take over the Mayan mysteries by pretending they were this beneficial etheric guardian named Tau, which had been a major TAU in Atlantis. And this is like the Emilius group, that whole Law of One piece in the Casey work. And what happens is there's a real danger that the Mayans, by ceding so much of their culture to this black magician, this Armonic black magician, and that the entirety of North America would be captured for generations and centuries. And what happens is in the Mayan literature, and we won't get into this part too much tonight, but it's important probably to know, which is the Vitzliputli character comes out of nowhere and saves the day. And he's kind of almost this Mayan version of Christ, contemporaries as they were. And he takes on this incredible Harmonic black magician. So we have three names now for this kind of mystical outfit that was hell-bent on destruction. Belial is the term that Casey used, which has a biblical overtone. And Baal and all these things. And the term Belial being in the oldest traditions of the Bible. And then you have Steiner talking about Ahriman, which is something that we're facing now and comes straight out of the Persian tradition of evil, occult evil. And then you have Blavatsky not denying either of those. Actually, she mentions both of them. But she's referring to this Thevetat group. So she's probably getting a snapshot of a time period that this came out of. And it's interesting because there are stories that later they kind of weaseled their way into the Tibetan mysteries and had to be expunged. So this is a very interesting piece. But one of the reasons I think it's important for us to take into account the occult esoteric side when dealing with, it's just that you're not just dealing with, when we say Atlantean technology, remember the way that it's described, that the Emilius group used the two-eye stone, for example. They're using it to communicate with the saintly realm, while the Belial group is using it as a kind of nuclear device. So it's good for us to understand the level of that and how this is kind of reincarnating through the AI piece. And there's a lot of reincarnation in tonight's episode as well. Before I go any further, I want to remind you to go and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch at darkjournalist.com, and it lets you know about the incredible documentaries, events, X-series shows, powerful interviews, and all the incredible things that we have coming up for you, and gets us around the intense, truly intense censorship that we've encountered. And it was funny. I mentioned this to Olivia before we started, but there was a thing in YouTube, and that they were promoting this whole thing. I noticed a lot of the larger channels trying to come off as independent now. They've been advertising heavy in YouTube. And there's this one thing they were doing, and it was Glenn Beck.
Yep.
And it said, "I'm being throttled on YouTube." And I
Mhm.
said, "Hello, Carrie Cassidy 2012.
Yep.
Amazing, isn't it? The whole thing has come full circle around. And of course, we really are throttled. But when you get somebody on that level like Beck, wow, this is really heavy duty. For them to be coming off with this. And it's funny because all of those people that were in very lofty positions, I mean, Beck made, I think he ended up making $300 million between Fox News and satellite radio. And, we see Joe Rogan, $350 million. You're supposed to be independent. Who's going to give you $350 million and then say whatever you want? It doesn't work that way. So, he's under the Spotify regime. And it's not like good things can't come out of these people. Don't get me wrong. I just want us to be aware of the level of free speech that we're talking about. And it's funny because I started the show off with Elizondo and all that, but Tucker Carlson, when he was on Joe Rogan, he was like, "I have in my speed dial right here, the head of the UFO program, and he's talking about Elizondo." I'm like, how much have you studied the UFO file, Tucker? Please, Elizondo is a CIA counterintelligence agent. How are you going to get the truth about UFOs from somebody like that? They're not going to give you anything about the UFO file. And so this is the large scale disconnect. So one of the things I talk about on this show is that the information I want to bring you, and including all the X series shows, whatever guests we have, documentaries, events, or whatever, I want all the stuff to be potent. And I want it to get around this, kind of quasi caricature of independent media. And so my whole goal with 2024 is especially to have the information be potent. And that's what I think we should look for, and less of the fluff, as it were. But before I go any further, Miss Olivia, before I jump into all this, please let me know what's going on out there.
MG says, question, are there any other sources about Atlantis other than Casey and Plato?
Yeah, you have an entire Hermetic tradition that includes it. You have all these various native cultures from Mexico, South America, China, who all have various versions of a sunken culture. Of course, the Aztecs called it Aztlan. It was the motherland that sank, And when you go into it, you'll find African tribes, other tribes, they all have a memory of this incredible conflagration, as it were. I think it's interesting, though, in the case of Atlantis and its destruction, whatever happened there, and it's so important to take Casey's version at this level, which is he talks about how the two-eyed stone, it's almost like the effect of if we had a gigantic EMP and it just knocked civilization out for a couple of thousand years. The two-eyed stone was set too high by the Belial group. They were, jacking it up to the maximum, as it were. And it caused a massive destruction, and it pulled down one of the islands. And so when we think of it that way, people look for different things like a gigantic comet hit that took place in the ancient past. There are stories along that line, but there's something about the Atlantis story that carries this kind of apotheum thing. And that's why even in the Plato story, there is, they angered the gods. So what took place was so hardcore that it almost took us off for humanity, took us off the complete spiritual evolutionary path. So, but in terms of mystery school information, of course, Blavatsky's information goes deep into Atlantis, and lots of theosophical literature, cosmic memory. I mean, Steiner's work is all, he came directly out of theosophy and took a lot of those truths about Atlantis with him. We have Francis Bacon talking about New Atlantis. So yeah, the sources are rather dramatic, in fact, but they heat up in such a way in the 19th century into the 20th century that it tells me that we were being prepped for something major, we were coming into a period. And, Casey had said that the year 2000 was a testing period. So what happens afterwards, a number of things come to the surface, like Atlantis. And, we come face to face with a number of prophecies that are at their end, and we stand, kind of recapturing from the amnesia, cultural amnesia, as it were. So this is what we're looking at, and I think a lot of it's what they're trying to do is gloss it over with a false version of UFO disclosure and get us out of the mode of looking at this thing and looking at the very important details about it. I have no doubt that the false Atlantean disclosure is coming up. Netflix is going to do their version of it, and I think they've already laid the groundwork. What else you got?
Roger Z says the story of Noah is the story of Atlantis.
It is. In fact, Casey mentions that's the second major destruction in Atlantis is the Noah story. But Noah's also a very unusual story because it carries with it this metaphor of all these animals and all the rest. And, was this maybe one of the more advanced Amelius scientists making sure he had all the DNA for these different animals? So when all this stuff happened, he could reanimate the entire species, levels of different species. This is how the Noah story, because it's also the story of the mystery schools keeping that information for times when the society goes mad. They go underground and then they kind of reemerge. This is the piece really that we get with the Rosicrucians. When there's this emergence of the Rosicrucians suddenly around the 1400s, it's been quiet there for a while. You had the major Roman Christian piece, and then, we have the so-called Dark Ages. But once you get into what happens with the Rosicrucians, then a lot of things start to open up. Edward D., Shakespeare, all kinds of pieces in history open up that have some mystical overhang. But when you get to the 19th century, you get into Ignatius Donnelly writing a huge bestseller about Atlantis. And this is so important because he was somebody deep, deep in the political process out of Minnesota, of all places. And
you never hear about Minnesota.
I know, not enough, for sure. A number of interesting characters come out of there. Prince, of course, famously came out of Minnesota. But I do feel that Ignatius Donnelly is a major key because he seemed to know more than just a researcher. And at the same time, he was running for vice president and had served in Congress and stuff. This was a guy with massive connections, and he's putting it all together. And there's plenty about the hot zone in the original work as well. So he's aware that this took place in the Atlantic. And I remember in some of the very early Casey readings, him talking about the Sargasso Sea being one of the major pieces of Atlantis. And that's why it was that area that nobody could get across. It was like, this is very difficult. And, but whenever he was talking about Bimini and the Bahamas, Cuba, and that whole area, he was always specifying this Poseidia connection. And Poseidia needs to be understood because this is kind of the height of the Amelius group in their spiritual technology, as it were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series episode. This is 170, Atlantis Anno 0. And it's Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group. You've got T.T. Brown and Alice in Wonderland in the hot zone in this one. I kid you not. So we're going to dive into this, and I'll mention this, we'll go a couple hours with you, like I said, but in the second half, we'll take your questions. And it's great to have so many of you here with us. And all of this information relates directly to the Hacking Atlantis documentary we just put out May 3rd, and keep your eyes on that. If you haven't watched it already, make sure you have that and share it. Please share it far and wide, or else we'll have to figure out a large-scale advertising campaign for it. Yes, Miss Olivia.
There are a few people in the chat. I know you don't want to go into it, but who have mentioned MH370. And could you just blow that out of the water right now?
Yeah, I mean, the original case of the disappearance of the plane is very important. And the false videos that they've been floating out there have been debunked by special effects people for a while now. And so the fact that they're recycling and recirculating this thing over and over again. There's plenty of good UFO footage to look at, and certainly studying the MH370 disappearance case of what could have happened with it. Both of those are legitimate. Somebody in some sort of marketing quirk have tried to wrap those together, and some of the people around it are getting kind of crazy too. So, but it's not something, it's not something where there's any ability to follow up with it, because the videos that they've shown have been debunked. So what else is there? Go into MH370 and figure out the disappearance. That's all very interesting, but there's some weird thing there about, UFOs took it down and all the rest. And the video just doesn't pan out. It's not authentic. And that's just the end of that.
Didn't Ashton actually admit that he faked it or something like that?
I don't know anything about him.
Okay.
And, but there's something about Kim.com and all that. But my feeling is that the subject matter is worth the MH370 disappearance. There could have been a major deep state move to make this thing disappear, but the video is nothing. All right, so let's see what else we have here tonight. We go into this through the three different figures. One of them is Blavatsky, and one of them is T.T. Brown. One of them that's unexpected in all of this is Eldridge Johnson. I'm going to read a bio of him since we go into this. And I think this is significant in that sense. By the way, just to cap off on what you said, one of the things that we try to have some kind of a filter for when we do dark journalism is junk conspiracy. So just like the driver did it, here's my phony video of the driver shooting JFK or something.
Or JFK faked his own death.
Oh, that's the worst.
Yeah,
think about that. So, you have this where the thing itself is so important, and there's so many levels on which it's been denied, and it gets so kind of out there and far out that you don't need this junk conspiracy. But the junk conspiracy often is thrown in there so everyone will go back to the official story. Remember that. So when you get into superstructures, you're talking about there's a marketing piece and a PR piece that goes with it too. Then you have a political layer on top, and then funding in the back somewhere. So we have to kind of keep a very good discerning eye when things jump up and everyone goes over a cliff. Remember the eclipse a couple weeks ago? That was the same type of thing, and there's this tendency to go over the cliff. And when you get around independent things, also a tendency for extreme cynicism, which is, tricky, along with, this whole kind of, I don't know, I guess you would call it, it's a terrible way to waste energy as well, because you get caught up in complaining about things, or you get caught up in just tearing things down on a superficial basis, instead of going into the deeper thing. And I see that all around. It goes round and round on Twitter. It goes round and round on social media. It's your 2 minutes hate for the day. Hey, hate Nancy Pelosi, look, Pelosi, Hillary, all those people, they're part of a system. And it is a very deep state piece, but those aren't the players that are running the show. So it's always important to go deeper on that and not just kind of for the superficial run. All right. And but I will say this, that certainly on the media side and on the political side, they've earned a great deal of cynicism, and through the COVID op, they earned more than usual. But the false UFO threat that they are rattling around, just wait. When they get around to that thing, extremely, extremely, dangerous because of the amount of emergency powers that can be applied in a situation like that. So let's get to know someone we may not know so well to understand the foundation of what the Caroline yacht has to do with Thomas Townsend Brown and has to do with these very deep expeditions that were funded at the very highest levels by the richest men in America directly into the hot zone to find these Atlantean ruins relating directly to this two-eye stone. Maybe unassuming character at first sight, and yet you go just a little bit, a millimeter deep, and watch out, you're in very deep territory. And that is the figure. Oh, by the way, Kelvin Coolidge comes up tonight.
Okay.
Speaking of marginal figures, very interesting indeed. But Eldridge Johnson, recently they did some kind of celebration because, of course, he funded so much of the activities of the University of Pennsylvania and around archaeology, science, and all this. And he is well known to us as the person who really, the whole thing about RCA and his master's voice and all the rest of it. He's the one, although he didn't invent the phonograph, he's the one who created the model of it, where people could go buy their favorite record, where they could kind of get this thing going on an assembly line. And he had a number of patents to his credit, so much so that he became one of the richest men in the world. Coming from fairly humble origins, and I would also say that he seems to have over and over again this attraction to, if you look for it, these esoteric themes. Now, born in Delaware in 1867, longtime resident of Philadelphia, Eldridge Johnson rose from humble origins as a machine shop apprentice to patent the early gramophone, the Victor talking machine. Sold 1.7 million phonograph records in 1902.
Wow.
So he's right at the beginning. He kind of like, imagine the .com craze.
Right,
this guy's
before taxes.
He's right at the cusp of it. And then he became one of the wealthiest Americans in the first decades of the 20th century. This is important when we get into the hot zone because over and over again, extreme wealth is involved. So these are the people who know and think they can get at it. Remember, now there's a lot of restrictions about what you can do in certain areas around the Bahamas and around the waters of Cuba, where they found a gigantic city underwater. So very interestingly, the first book by our friend Charles Dodgson, who's also Lewis Carroll, and was the person who was overseeing the Ashmolean wing of Oxford, which had the deepest and heaviest collection of esoteric and hermetic material, some of the deepest occult, probably the biggest occult library in the world at that time. And Dodgson is right in the middle of it, overseeing all of it. That's quite a gig for him to go.
Could you spell Ashmolean?
Yes. Ashmolean. This is a very important character. And he's somebody who was around in the 17th century, and he laid the foundation and put together this incredible occult library there at Oxford. And there's a lot we can go into relating to him, but let's keep going. The manuscript, the first draft of the manuscript was called Alice's Adventures Underground. That's important. And also, when you think of some of the Vril type material, again, you're dealing with a lot of stuff about underground civilizations and underground experiences. But what's fascinating is you may have remembered that when I talk about Thomas Townsend Brown, I mentioned this incredibly rich man on a yacht who shows him this version of Alice in Wonderland. That's the original version, and it's in this glass casing. And Brown says, well, why do you have it all locked up like that? Just because it's so precious or whatever. And he said, no, if the yacht goes down, the manuscript survives forever. So there was something very deep. But when I found this guy's 50-year devotion to this manuscript, I started to wonder how it involved his work there in the hot zone. and we get into it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you a picture tonight of the subject of Alice Little, who was the subject that became Alice in Wonderland, according to popular legend, meeting with Eldridge Johnson at the end of her life, which shows you the level of which he was deep in the Alice underground rabbit hole. Now, what we have here is a very interesting piece getting into Johnson's background. Johnson is also fascinating because he's one of these guys who moves through the industry and he has all the right moves in the 20s. So his fortune kind of doubles and doubles and doubles, and he becomes the ultimate philanthropist. But one of the institutions that he starts giving intense money to is the University of Pennsylvania, which is also where Edgar Cayce said the emblem of the Firestone, and maybe some of the Firestones themselves ended up at. And you're going to find whenever we go into deep territory around esoteric themes, the University of Pennsylvania shows up over and over again, along with the Smithsonian, which is also featured tonight because he did and funded major expeditions by the Smithsonian directly into the hot zone. And the idea was, oh, we're going to scrape the ocean bottom and come up with all these mollusks and, shells and things and test their age. What was really going on, good cover, was he's part of that program, just like Hemingway, scanning the ocean floor there looking for ruins of Atlantis. Now, there's another piece, I think, here, and I want to say this about Johnson, which is he seems to have Washington in his pocket. And at a certain point, he actually goes to the White House and he meets with Calvin Coolidge and shows him this manuscript of Alice in Wonderland. This thing obviously is getting around, and very interesting indeed. His son wrote a bio about him, and we get some glimpse of why the fascination around Alice. Then I'm going to go to Alice herself, the character and the real thing, and then to Helena Blavatsky and her entire kind of occult history of Atlantis. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 170, Atlantis Anno 0, Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group, along with Alice in Wonderland, T.T. Brown in the hot zone. Here we go. Now, this is from the Sun's bio of Eldridge Johnson. It was about that year that Mr. Johnson began to read Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and other writings. There is a fascination about Lewis Carroll's writings other than his attempts at philosophy and logic because his stories are so completely wacky, while at the same time they accurately portray human characters. The matter became fixed in my mind because on numerous occasions my father recited Carroll's poem Jabberwocky. Jabberwocky's is, for me, it's esoteric schoolwork. And what I found out is that over and over again, Carroll went to the publisher and said, is there a way for you to publish this backwards? And you might remember later in Alice's further adventures that she'll go through the mirror and she goes through the looking glass there. And when she gets there, she sees things backwards. So it says, goodness knows what language it is in, but the word Jabberwocky means to go round and round. While poetry is not musical, there is a rhythm to it, which reminds one. And then, so there's a little hint there. He's talking about his dad reciting this Jabberwocky poem on a regular basis. What happens later is he talks about how his dad goes to the White House. And it's interesting because the president at the time is Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin Coolidge, he has a wife that is often refers to herself as Alice in Wonderland. And that's even true when he was a governor here in Massachusetts. The wife has this tendency to go around and around saying that she's Alice in Wonderland. So that's unusual. But anyway, it's going to be Johnson that goes there and shows this to him. That may have been a reason to meet for something else, but nonetheless, they do it. this is a shot of Coolidge's wife, who thinks she's Alice in Wonderland. And this is, of course, the logo for what became RCA, his master's voice. That is Eldridge's company right there. What becomes interesting as we look a little bit deeper is Coolidge himself has some unusual things. There's a picture that I found of Coolidge with Al Jolson and John Drew, who was a big actor at the time. And what's interesting to me about that is there's a very interesting Edgar Cayce reading where John Drew comes through and starts to talk to him about what it's like being on the other side. You know, John Drew had recently passed away, and he's coming through Cayce and giving this big diatribe about the psychic. And he says, you know, what happens very often is psychics, actors tend to be good psychics because they're able to empty themselves of their personality. And this is why Casey's a good psychic, because he is taking his entire personality and leaving it aside by going into this trance. And so we're getting all this incredible lecture from John Drew on the psychic aspect of the other side in a Cayce reading. Well, it's very interesting that just a couple of years before, there he is standing with Calvin Coolidge. So when I saw that picture, I knew we were in for a good night here. So I'm going to get into Alice in Wonderland now. A number of you have sent me pictures of, and I've seen the recent portrait of the King Charles over in England, and the incredibly satanic imagery of him in this red. And whenever we talk about red, we know red is flame, red's blood, all of these different things. For any monarch to have himself dressed out like that, tricked out in satanic gear. And there are people who have sort of done some interesting super impositions and things about the image. And I will say this very often, everyone can go over a cliff about this. This one in particular has a lot of occult imagery when it's overlaid. So there's so many strange occult things that I got to thinking about why King Charles, who, they say is kind of near death, would be sort of prancing around this satanic imagery in his official portrait. And also the kind of elephant out of the room. I mean, can you even imagine Queen Elizabeth being like, "Hey, check this picture of me," and all my, but yeah, I mean, something strange is definitely happening. But I did hearken back to Alice in Wonderland again, because there we have the Red Queen, and the Red Queen does all these truly diabolical things and tries to trick Alice over and over again. She's a very problematic character. But
she's psychotic.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But when you think about this in relation to Charles, the red here, I think is significant. And also, I think that Alice in Wonderland is a true esoteric tome. And I think that a lot of Lewis Carroll's work is mystery school homework. And there's no doubt that there's, its regular commercial aspects or commercial function as well. But he's using schoolwork a lot, and probably through the combination of his esoteric knowledge from the Ashmolean wing of Oxford, and then having that plus being a master mathematician, the combination of the two is really quite extraordinary. I want to mention here that he became an avid theosophist, and Theosophy wasn't big when he was writing Alice, but he was plugged into esoteric groups through his connections, like I mentioned. Now, the person who was around before the Alice story was Emma Britton. And Emma Britton, I believe that the legacy, the story of Emma Britton, stirred in circles for a long time, because when Emma was between 11 and 14, she worked for the Orphic Circle, and she would go into trance and give the most amazing information. But the people involved with the Orphic Circle were very secretive, and some of them we found out later were people like British Prime Minister, future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, and the author Charles Dickens. And she recounts some truly remarkable things. By the time he's writing Alice, she's working for Abraham Lincoln and giving him, she's doing kind of PR and campaign stuff for him, but also plugging him in this mediumistic network. She becomes one of the founders with Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society. So you have to, if you really want to connect the dots on where this stuff is coming from, Emma Britton is very important. Traditionally, it's thought that the inspiration, the model, was Alice Little. And Alice Little, it's interesting, will show up on a number of occasions in almost this kind of Golden Dawn garb. And supposedly it's just for photo sessions and things later in life after she's moved on from her association with Lewis Carroll, who was a friend of her family and used to take the children on these boat rides and things and kind of get their imagination to open up to tell him these stories. Now, in Emma Britton's case, it's very interesting because, in fact, she was the genuine article with Alice. So I believe that this story, this echo of this child having this super cosmic experience, came directly out of that Orphic Circle information, which Carol would have had access to. But I will say that it's interesting also because, the kind of the trademark of the Orphic Circle is that there's something about youth that when they're using these youths for these channeling sessions. And what she would say later about them, Emma Britton herself, she didn't have any bad things to say about them. She said that they taught her so much about how to use her abilities and then helped her move into a kind of an acting career afterwards. So, but it is a heavy strain to put on somebody of that age. So very
That's
unusual.
interesting because it's the reversal of the actor psychic thing. First it's psychic, then actor.
Oh, true.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. The Alice piece becomes, I think, very important. The picture I'm going to show you now is Eldridge Johnson meeting Alice Little, the inspiration for Alice. And this meeting takes place on the 100th anniversary of Charles Dodgson's, Lewis Carroll's birth. And it's quite amazing. It takes place in America, and they have their session, and he takes her to see the original manuscript. So keep that in mind because we haven't even gone afloat to the hot zone with Johnson yet. But the Alice in Wonderland piece is gigantic. And immediately upon meeting our friend Thomas Townsend Brown, he's showing him this piece and saying, here's Alice in Wonderland. Now, what I want to suggest about Johnson is that he is directly connected to the mystery schools, and the Alice in Wonderland piece is kind of his signature for when he's dealing with this. And all of the expeditions and pieces that he founds, it's funny because he's doing this funding of these different expeditions that are looking at things in the hot zone. And they don't say they're expeditions looking for ruins or whatever. They're looking for the age of the sea or the seabed. But one of the fascinating pieces when you get in with him is that suddenly in 1933, he's taking the Caroline, his own yacht, and equipping it so he can do his own expedition. And he's going to say, well, this is a joint Johnson-Smithsonian piece. So he brings his whole family along. He's got T.T. Brown in there and all of these different various experts and the letting off weather balloons and doing all kinds of things. Supposedly, again, they're just looking for crustaceans on the seabed. But the places that they go, including the western tip of Cuba, Puerto Rico, they're all operative right there in the hot zone. And they form another piece of this network collecting fragments of this large scale underground metropolis of ruins that we've been pointing out in the work of everyone from Egerton Sykes, who was a British intelligence agent who said, they've basically have the Temple of Isis down there in the Bahamas. And, people like Paulina Zalitsky that we've highlighted as maybe one of the greatest. If you think about Paulina Zalitsky's story of finding this Cuban city, what could be more of a disaster for archaeology than ignoring it or, moving along from that story because she got harassed by the Cuban government, who had originally hired her to find it or find Spanish galleons. And I pointed out before that Spanish galleons, when you get into this kind of work, are the code word for Atlantis. So, of course, there are normal, explorers who look for Spanish galleons. But when you get into things like finding ruins in the hot zone, Spanish galleons is about the best cover you can name. And everyone from Gordon Cooper to Fidel Castro has used it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew, we're off to a crazy start
already.
Just
beginning.
Atlantis Anno, Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group. Going to get into Blavatsky after the Alice in Wonderland piece. I want to remind you, if you're new here, especially to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That keeps us in touch. It's a free newsletter, but all the exciting shows, interviews, X-series shows, and events, special events, documentaries, it's all there. And you can get it directly in your inbox for free once a week on Fridays. We'll let you know what's going on. The other thing I want to point out is that with the things that we have coming up, you're going to want to, be first, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And very often with YouTube and Facebook and others, I always hear people saying, I didn't get a notification. And the best way to stay in touch is directly through that newsletter, because the censorship is real. And unlike Glenn Beck, we have the real thing. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I got so much already. We could just skip the show and go straight to Q&A. David Terminus says, actually, there's a link on Lewis Carroll's wiki page about his crypto work that links directly to Johannes Trithemius.
Mm-hmm.
Alchemy by Angela says, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but MK Ultra uses the Alice reference to their mind-controlled trauma-based programs, Dark Alice.
Oh, yeah.
And MG says, DJ, what about the Cheshire Cat turning into the moon and separating its head from the body, as Steiner noted about the Luciferian impulse?
Well, what you made me think of is the Betty and Barney Hill story.
Ooh.
Because when he is looking at the aliens with his binoculars, he realizes it kind of mutates a little bit for him. At first, it's a gray, and then he thinks it's someone that looks Irish. And then he goes into the Nazi thing. But then after that, if you keep going with him, he said, oh, it's the Cheshire Cat from the Alice in Wonderland story, and I'm the bunny. I'm going to be trapped.
Oh, right.
So he goes into this whole thing, and if you think about that, it's quite remarkable because, it was interesting when I was looking at Alice in Wonderland, for some reason, just this particular time, because we've done some really deep dive on Alice, and I won't go into all of the spectacular imagery going on there. But what I went back to was Crowley's character of Lamb. And I was thinking, wouldn't Lamb have been right at home in Alice in Wonderland? If you think about it. Yeah, he would be right there. He's got the big head. He's an exaggerated source, It's very interesting. I promised you the picture of Al Jolson, Calvin Coolidge, and John Drew. John Drew, the late actor who channeled through Edgar Cayce. There it is, with Calvin in the middle. Most unusual. And if you don't know your 20s stars, that's Drew.
I'm having a weird memory. Is John Drew somehow related to Drew Barrymore, I think?
Oh, I believe that's true. Yeah, yes.
Because I think her father's name is John Drew Barrymore.
Yes, exactly. Right. And he comes out of that as well. It's very interesting. I'm not sure exactly how they're related, but they are. Mm-hmm. And that's Swanee River, Al Jolson right there. True rock star of his own time.
Related to another bunny, Bugs Bunny. Of course.
Absolutely. So now So imagery wise, I think you hit on something there with the Cheshire Cat piece. And so I went into that. It's also interesting, the thing that, was it David Termina who mentioned that about steganography?
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
That is, once we get that crossover going with steganography, think about how much steganography is in Alice in Wonderland. That's the root that you start to see. That's how you start to connect those dots. And so there's more steganography to be had tonight. In terms of pictures, I wanted to show one more before we launch into this. This is a picture of Thomas Townsend Brown aboard the Caroline doing the Hot Zone expedition. And that is Eldridge Johnson's son over there. Here we have the only picture of him operating machinery. I do have a shot of him with a weather balloon on the deck of the Caroline, but here he is. We're getting just a glimpse of T.T. Brown in action, very young. And remember, this is a strange thing, because after he discovered the whole Byfield-Brown effect with this other scientist relating to magnetism, and it's a very kind of a heavy breakthrough for a guy in his 20s. The U.S. Navy wanted him really badly, and on his first mission, they send him to Cuba, and when he shows up, there's a massive earthquake. And that's all very strange, along with the idea that he is testing deep sea submersibles, and then we'll spend all this time in San Antonio, Cuba. And I always tell the story about, because this is the story that T.T. Brown's daughter told me, which was all about how the family thought for years and years, when he was going to San Antonio for a month with Robert Sarbarker, who was the UFO, the physicist who blew the lineage out there about who controlled the UFO file, including Vannevar Bush, and who they've punished by kind of keeping underground from history. When they have Oppenheimer out there, he was contemporary with Oppenheimer and certainly on the same level. He was a student of Einstein. So, but I also think that, Oppenheimer's very interesting. So it's just strange the way they've done this with Sarbarker, who really let it out and said, oh yeah, not only did we do crash retrievals, but we found beings inside. And the beings are very insect-like. So we try to figure out, who could have manufactured them. So that's the way that he said they were thinking about it. And Sarbarker was best friends with T.T. Brown. So you have to have that as part. If you're going to understand, in my opinion, the UFO file and the Hot Zone Atlantis research piece, you have to get the crossover with both of their expertise. Because when you have T.T. Brown later, after he's done all these Atlantis, research, that he's doing these deep programs for the Navy, then what does he do? He founds these major and really the foundational UFO groups for the public in the 1950s, like NICAP and others, and he tries to pull in the good scientists, and the program gets thwarted. So you've got the UFO file there, and so when do you think UFO file and Atlantis? Well, that's AUTEC, right? It's the Area 51 right off of the Andros Island. So, this is how we can navigate through this area and timepiece and keep it as a thread going. And so, we get our heads wrapped around Brown working on this expedition. The expeditions in the Hot Zone are crucial for us to understand what took place, because Hemingway is right in the heart of that. And so when you have Hemingway operating in the Hot Zone looking for these ruins, you have Hemingway's brother, creating the new Atlantis by buying lots in the Hot Zone. There's something that these people know about. And I'd like to, mention Egerton Sykes, because he's left completely out of the conversation. Egerton Sykes had the kind of most vast Atlantis library, and he said it was quite understood by all sides in the Cold War, the Russians, the Chinese, and these countries that were hostile to us, like Cuba and things like that, that there was a massive network of ruins there in the hot zone, and everyone wanted access to them, but either they were in territorial waters or international waters, and incidents were set off constantly, and they all try to figure out how to get around each other. So we have a lot on record with this. So the hot zone becomes that much more of a practical reality when we start to take their statements in mind. When you go into the Casey work and the Steiner work, you're getting the mystical vision of the whole thing. And that is going to the heart of why those ruins are there and what's happening with it. And I mentioned Casey there. This is what he said the trouble was all about, which is the Two-Eye Stone. And you'll note that a NASA scientist in the 1970s named William Hutton, that was a pseudonym he used, he went through the Casey readings and studied the Two-Eye Stone, and he said, this is what it is. And the stone that Casey said controlled the Atlantean culture somehow drew upon the sun and other large stars, and it became the power center for Atlantis. Casey, in putting that two-eye piece together, gave us a notion of that this culture was ruled by it in terms of its technological advances, that the world had never gotten that far scientifically. We still haven't. But that the root of the technology didn't have anything to do, it wasn't there as like a war device and things of that nature. It was completely run by this Amelius group for peaceful purposes of, kind of reanimating the spiritual lives of the people, and that they trained priestesses to interact with the outer spheres through the two-eye crystal. It's interesting because there's a lot of Celtic legends around, this period after, kind of post-Atlantean legends. And it's interesting when you hear about Murius, because Murius is the location, in the right location for where Bimini was. But this sounds like a larger island, but it was known for its incredible crystal temples and the dramatic things that would happen there. This got reinterpreted later as the Fountain of Youth, which we had all these Spanish explorers looking for because they heard about this from the natives. And it is that Murius piece that gives us the echo there from the Celtic legends directly to this piece about the Two-Eye Stone and what was left of it there. Casey talks about a miniature version of the Two-Eye Stone, which would magnetize other stones that they could use. Kind of think of it like, portable, almost like an iPhone. And it's fascinating because he claimed that an emblem of this Two-Eye Stone and the smaller firestones, and I'm going to read the quote tonight, but he almost makes it sound like the actual stones themselves that they were uncovering there in the Yucatan were being shipped directly to the University of Pennsylvania. And Casey went on record saying, look, so there isn't any confusion, I'm going to tell you, right now the expedition is being done in Yucatan, and it's going to be sent to the University of Pennsylvania. Now, there's a trick there because Pennsylvania State Museum comes up, and there's been a lot of crisscross about who actually got these ruins. But interestingly enough, it's the University of Pennsylvania that shows up over and over again when it comes along to these esoteric topics. There's something in there about, whether it's the Carnegie Mellon piece or it has to do with Eldridge Johnson. We're getting something major about the University of Pennsylvania, and we've highlighted that in a number of investigations. The thing is, when you get to the University of Pennsylvania, somebody who was there in the same location at a certain point was Madame Blavatsky. I'm going to get into that next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the Atlantis Anno 0. And by the way, that expedition that Casey was talked about is the same expedition that Eldridge Johnson had sent down there into Mexico. And we're going to get the overlay between Casey's reading and what's going on there with Johnson as well. We're going to take your questions here pretty shortly now. And Miss Livia, in the meantime, what do you got?
Okay, so Chris Lothian wants to know how do they actually control the output levels of the 2-eye stone? Do we know? And Windhammer says the stone is still active, I believe. Does it do anything if it is not being activated by someone who knows how to use it? Does it have any kind of innate power, or does it need a human to interact with it to activate it?
Well, he said it was kept in a building and that they would roll back the top of the building and have, the sun or these stars interact with it, and it would do all this stuff, and then they would roll it back. And he actually, Casey describes in detail the kind of non-conductive building the Atlanteans created for the main 2-eye stone. But these were power stations all over the island continent, I should say. So it's quite interesting. Now, remember that it malfunctioned. It was set too high. It caused a gigantic EMP style event or worse, and set civilization, the culture, and humanity back. So much so that they adopted this exteganography in very early times to keep the tradition of the hidden information alive, but to keep it away from the ruling culture, because they would take the power and use it just like they did in the Atlantean period. So it was better off the less kind of advanced technology we had. That was the thinking going on. I think that you need to draw in when you get into the Casey readings, when you're talking about Steiner and when you're talking about Blavatsky, they are drawing not only on the lives of the individuals who come to them for life readings and things of this nature, or in looking at their background and the different incarnations that they've had. They're relying on their own incarnations in those periods of time as well. And it's interesting. There's a very famous theosophical artist who, and I had this picture in the thumbnail. Some of you are familiar with it, but this is extraordinary because he put himself in this state to see the past lives. And this was the true appearance of Helena Blavatsky as this kind of Atlantean warrior princess. So that was George William Russell, and he gives us a glimpse into that. Very often, even now, there are stories about Blavatsky. Oh, that fraud Blavatsky, or she made it up or whatever. It's really interesting to me because there's something about Blavatsky that is still a lightning rod in all of it. But I actually ran across a major CBC article talking about Blavatsky being a fraud and really trying to take her down. The article was from last year. So how active a program is that? Yeah, interestingly enough, they don't like that hanging out there. Just like when they went after the Steiner schools for not being on the COVID train. You got to watch them. In this area, I want to do a little thing about Philadelphia here for a second. In Philadelphia, in the 1870s, you have Helena Blavatsky before she goes to New York, and she's living right where the University of Pennsylvania is. You have our friend John Worrell Keeley, who will put together this technology that everyone on the mystery school track, from Blavatsky to Steiner to others, will just say, well, he's discovered basically the psychic ether power. And there's all kinds of stories about what he demonstrated for the U.S. Army, that a disc that could go 500 miles an hour, a flying disc. And I ran across, in the 100th anniversary, I did a show on this, but it was the 100th anniversary of this magazine, and they were talking about their various exploits. One of them was about when a journalist went to see one of these demonstrations that John Keeley did. And this is in the 1870s in Philadelphia. And the English reporter showed up and saw this disc flying all over the place, responding to instruments that Keeley was playing. So that's the shot that I found. And we tied the whole thing into the Strader device, which was something that Steiner highlighted. And it is this etheric force technology that Keeley maintained. And there are people who've researched Keeley and gone really deep on this, but you can see from the theosophical literature that they understood that he had basically psychic technology. What's important about that is he's using a disc in that demonstration. And then later, when you get into the airship craze or the UFO craze, we're getting into this disc shape aspect again. And you're getting into this psychic manifestation of technology. That's very important. I guess that would be the big takeaway there. In terms of Blavatsky, though, her presence down there is very interesting because it's always been known as a major Rosicrucian mystery center in Philadelphia, in that period in particular. But she's down there, and what happens to her is she has a terrible fall and she injures her leg. It's actually at risk of amputation at a certain point. And she is communing, with her masters and things. And she runs across this dog and she adopts it. And the dog spends all this time with her, but he rests on her leg, and he actually spends this time with her, and she attributes her entire healing to the presence of this dog. Now there's still a place there in that very same location right by the University of Pennsylvania called the White Dog, and they call it the White Dog because of this peculiar history of Blavatsky being there in Philadelphia. Quite remarkable. But she has that final kind of transformation at that point. She's faced death on a number of occasions. At one point, there's a boat that she's on that a lot of ammunition blows up that's being smuggled because of these wars that are going on. And she has to swim to shore. And when she gets up from that experience, she feels not quite herself anymore. It's as if someone else is there with her or has taken over who she is. I found that interesting.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, no question about it. And, her sister said, well, she was always quite remarkable. And there are all these stories. If you think about, I'm trying to.
Sorry, Rotten Crypto Bits, same White Dog as RCA Victor Dog.
Oh, interesting points. That's who he is. Excellent. Yeah.
So observant.
That shot, I think, is quite remarkable as well. But I think the upshot of what was going on there is that she was having this kind of, she'd had a few incidents where she was going to die on a horse, and she felt that this master had kept her in suspended animation so she could land softly and not kill herself, things of this nature. And later she would meet that master face to face. So this was something that went on for a while. But her sister, they recounted, her whole family recounted these unusual things, which sounded very much like Bewitched or something. Totally. Because she could levitate objects, and she could, have her purse come flying over to her and things like that. So she, from a very young age, is, already deep in the psychic realm. And as I've mentioned before, there were secret societies that tracked her birth astrologically, saying someone very significant is going to be born there in the Ukraine. And so, quite remarkable indeed. But that thing about Philadelphia, there's an exposition that takes place in Philadelphia in 1884, and Tesla is there for that. And an 18-year-old Eldridge Johnson, who will become friends with Edison later, is in Philadelphia at the same time as the exposition. There's no doubt in my mind that he was involved with it, or that he was there or something. I don't have the actual record of it, but there's something about the threads going on in Philadelphia at that period of time. And right in the heart of it, we have Johnson gearing up to become the main man for the expeditions to the hot zone and funding to the tune of millions of dollars these expeditions on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania and working with the Smithsonian. And we know very well about the Smithsonian's interesting proclivities for hiding the various things that they discover. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, Atlantis Anno Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group. I'm going to read something about Thevetat, and then we're going to go to your questions. How does that sound?
Okay, I'm going to throw this at you first. David Termini says, DJ, Benjamin Franklin was the OG Philadelphian steganography expert. Fenimore said if you weren't born in Philly, you couldn't get into their exclusive society.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
He had to settle for being in that other major prestigious organization because he didn't have the parents that had been there in Philadelphia. Quite interesting. I think the book, I have excerpts from the book. I could probably keep us all here reading fascinating excerpts from the book that the son wrote. One thing I will say is he's talking about expeditions and the various things that they had in kind of the itemized pieces that they had and the various things that he had bought or picked up. A couple of things grabbed me. There was an absolutely a perfect crystal sphere, 10 inches in diameter, probably a world's record. Many pieces of coral and jade, and dishes made of spinach jade and green and white jade. There was a lapis lazuli table screen, 9 3/4 inches high. So, what happens is all of these pieces he puts together and then he gives them to the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. Now, when we get into the Casey work, it's the same museum of the University of Pennsylvania, but Casey is saying Pennsylvania Museum, so people got confused about exactly where it was. Some of those items, though, including the lapis lazuli, I instantly started thinking about the Bisbee mines, and Casey saying the Atlanteans went to these Bisbee mines and got the incredible lapis that was there. And it reminds me that there's a whole thing about the singing stone at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's an incredible, I think it's a 2-ton block of azurite. But this is the true lapis, according to Casey, from a copper mine, the same copper mine that Casey will go down there with Mitchell Hastings in this incredible whirlwind. And Mitchell Hastings will create FM radio and things. And they'll go down there and have these incredible metaphysical experiences in the Queen's mine. In Bisbee. And the strange things that happen to them there are truly supernatural on the good side, and also lots of incredible blocks, like all the flat tires that Casey has. They have 5 flat tires in one afternoon as they're heading towards the mine. And Casey's writing in his diary, I don't know what's going on here. And Casey's family is wondering, why did he take off to this mine and all the rest of it? But when he gets there, the visions that he has in his readings start to come alive for him, including the visitation of his dead mother, who gives him things, actual objects. So there are so many strange things associated with that lapis mine there in Bisbee. So I think that that's something we're still on the trail of story-wise, but whenever lapis comes up in the middle of this, that always gets me. I'm going to read this quote from the Casey readings. This is about, he's talking directly here about the expedition that Eldridge Johnson has funded into Guatemala. And he's referring to Yucatan because that's how they refer to the whole area. But it turns out, and we did an episode called Pawgate, which gets into a lot of this, but the area that it looks like he's discussing specifically and where the expedition took place was called Piedras Negras. And we went into the whole meaning of the paw and all that, and how Pawgate is basically, the right paw of the Sphinx is where the Atlantean records are under. Well, here we have another paw. And by the way, there's another Sphinx involved that we've shown that. The Yucatan Sphinx disappeared, but there's lots of photos of it. Okay. So now Casey's giving this individual a past life reading about how they were so active in Atlantis and they used the two-eye stone. And here he's saying, you're going to get a chance maybe to use it again. So let's just get a little pinch of this, and then I'll read Thevetat and we'll go to your questions.
Okay.
All right. In describing the manner of construction of the two-eye stone, we found it was large cylindrical glass, as would be termed today, cut with facets in such a manner that the capstone on the top made for the centralizing of the power of force that concentrated between the end of the cylinder and the capstone itself. As indicated, the records of the manners of the construction of the two-eye stone are in 3 places in the earth as it stands today. In the sunken portions of Atlantis or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini, off the coast of Florida, and in the temple records that were in Egypt, where the entity later acted in cooperation with others in preserving the records that came from the land where these have been kept. Also the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America, where these stones, okay, the fire stones, that they know so little about are now, 1933, that's when the Johnson expedition is, during the last few months, being uncovered. And then the question comes in, is it for this entity to again learn of the use of these stones? And Casey says, when these have come, those individuals who will purify themselves in the manner necessary for gaining the knowledge and the entering in of the chambers, these should be found, yes. In Yucatan, there's an emblem of same. Now, here's the crucial part that brings us into the University of Pennsylvania strangeness. Let's clarify this, for it may be more easily found, for they will be brought to this America, these United States. A portion is to be carried, as we find, to the Pennsylvania State Museum. A portion is to be carried to Washington, preservation of such finds, Smithsonian, and to Chicago. And then he goes in talking about the various stones and the magnetization, etc. So that reference to the Pennsylvania State Museum turns out to be the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And they were the ones who were running, at the behest of Johnson, the expedition in Piedras Negras. So we've got a lot there that connects up with his readings versus what was happening on the ground. But the people who were involved here, again, Brown working directly with Johnson in the hot zone on this. So we have it, Casey, Brown, and Johnson, and then, of course, Casey giving the information about all this to Hemingway's mother. So we've got a circle of knowledge and contacts there that give us a real opening into what was happening. But now we ask ourselves, how is it that these people who were doing it, Johnson in particular, understood that there was a city under there? There's some tradition going on. There's some passing of knowledge, person to person, group to group, about ruins in the hot zone as far back as the 1920s and 30s. Well, when we get into, the whole bit about finding Atlantis and stuff, you really have to understand that there's a whole group that's very aware of it. And it's only the little bits of information that we understand and hear things about that we even know about it. Otherwise, all of this would go completely out the window. So if we hadn't sort of gotten that window into the hot zone in the first place, and it comes through a combination of mystery school information on one side, and then the record of these expeditions on the others, and then testimony of people like Zalitsky, or people who've contacted me about what's going on there in the hot zone. So we're really on the precipice of something. And I find it interesting because, I get a lot of emails about Antarctica, and I'm very interested, and we've done some shows about what was going on in Antarctica. And I think that the research needs to go to the next level on Antarctica. But the hot zone becomes something that we have much more of a grasp on, and it's far more accessible, as it were, even with all the geopolitical strains and such. Remember, at a certain point, the hot zone was going to cause the end of civilization in the standoff if Kennedy hadn't settled it peacefully there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the hot zone represents an area that still has that imprint of controlling the rest of the globe. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show deep, deep tonight through the rabbit hole. A little bit of Alice, a little bit of T.T. Brown, and Casey. Now to Blavatsky. We will go and then to your questions. And I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, and that's what keeps us in touch and lets you know about the extraordinary things we have coming up, including the things we have out now, like the Craze in the Hot Zone, Hacking Atlantis documentary. That's a 90-minute presentation that we did, and it's power-packed with graphics and all sorts of research that you're going to need to know about. Share that. We've made it free and available for everyone, and it's right here on the channel. And share it far and wide, because this is the information that's crucial and necessary. And, a lot of people, because I do so much work around the UFO file, will talk to me about disclosure and things. Look, the UFO disclosure is one piece of what's going on, but the disclosure of advanced Atlantean ruins in the hot zone is dramatic. And the UFO overlay around those areas, by the way, places like Bimini, where it's so common that they call them fireflies, maybe we can start to put some perspective together on this, instead of the people running over a cliff at the word of every CIA agent who's like, oh, I'm going to give you UFO truth. And you have this, kind of incredible committee of UFO authors and people around the subject, who've been generally opposed to government secrecy and things like that. And, these counter intel people show up, and these guys go over the cliff with them, and they're like, hey, don't you dare attack our CIA guy who's going to give us the truth about UFOs. So that school of UFO research is pretty much done. The UFO file research can be done, but it has to be completely separated out from the CIA honchos doing that kind of manipulation. And I think when you get into the Atlantis piece, this is rising, and a lot of it's rising through the work that we're doing here, Gigi Young and others, really bringing that wave of information forward on this. You're going to see a lot about Atlantis coming up here. We have a chance to set the tone about the discoveries based on the actual research, and a lot of that goes directly into the hot zone. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Chris Lothian, have you guys ever done a show about ley lines? The area around the hot zone and the Yucatan lies on a ley line that runs up through Ireland and Scotland before curving back down to Egypt and the pyramids. Were these crystalline communication lines?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a complete show on ley lines and the old straight track and these kinds of things would be great. We've laced all that in to the various shows dealing with monoliths as a network, which I think is significant. And when you look at a lot of those monoliths, you can see the outlines there of what used to be the power stations, and their astronomical positions are probably crucial to that.
There's a great old In Search Of. It's my favorite episode.
What is that?
The title is something like Ancient Astronauts. It's something like
that.
Oh,
really?
But anyway, it deals.
They had in the 70s. They had incredible shows. If you go back, it's funny because I wish I'd been around for a lot of this stuff. If you go through the 60s and the 70s, you'll find they had such a they didn't have the technological capability, right? And so the special effects and stuff are terrible, but they really have, boom, this incredible piece. By the way, there's a shot, one of the original drawings that Carol is making alongside his Alice. This is when she starts to lose perception and she grows really, really tall. Interesting indeed. What else you got?
You caught me at a bad moment.
Okay, no, that's good. That's good. You're doing great over there. Let's see. Why don't we what I'm going to do is I'm going to read an extract from King Thevetat, which is directly from Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. It'll give us a hint of her Belial version of how these master black magicians had taken over, and give us a hint of where she's coming from to give us this information. I may do a separate episode just on Thevetat, but let's get her version. And again, this is Blavatsky, going out on a limb and really shocking the culture in the 1870s, bringing out stories of Atlantis. Quite remarkable. And I always remember what Steiner had to say about Blavatsky, which is that true initiates from the mystery schools stood at the cradle of theosophy. He thought things that she was doing and putting this together was an incredible revelation for humanity. And later problems in her psychic imprisonment and things, I think the same type of group who were master black magicians, they've kind of reincarnated to do battle with her again. And there she was in AE's vision in the Atlantean warrior suit that we showed earlier. Let's get a handle on what a powerful change this woman made. Okay, here we go. King Thevetat, tradition says, and the records of the great book explain, that long before the days of Adam and his inquisitive wife, Eva, where now are found but salt lakes and desolate barren deserts, there was a vast inland sea which extended over Middle Asia, north of the proud Himalayan range, an island for which it is unparalleled in beauty and no rival in the world, was inhabited by the last remnant of the race that preceded ours. This race could live with equal ease in water, air, or fire, for it had an unlimited control over the elements. These were the sons of God, not those who saw the daughters of men. This is interesting because they have the whole sons of God who mated with the daughters of men and then produced giants, and the giants became this huge problem. She's saying it's another group. They're also sons of God, but they're not those. I'm always interested when you get these different strains. And she said, these are the real Elohim. In the Oriental Kabbalah, they have another name. It was they who imparted nature's most weird secrets to men and revealed to them the ineffable and now lost word. This word, which is no word, has traveled around the globe and still lingers in a far-off dying echo in the hearts of some privileged men. The hierophants of all of these priesthood colleges were aware of the existence of this island, but the word was known only to Yava Alim, the chief lord of every college. She's referring here to mystery schools. So college school. And was passed to his successor only at the moment of death. There were many such colleges, and the old classic authors speak of them. There was no communication with the fair island by sea, but subterranean passages known only to the chiefs communicated with it in all directions. So she's saying underground here is how they got around. They didn't show up by boat. They knew these underground caverns, and they all would meet up there. Very unusual. Who can tell but the lost Atlantis, which is also mentioned in the secret book, but again under another name pronounced in the sacred language. The great lost continent might have existed, the south of Asia. She goes into this whole thing. She said it's certainly not a joke of Plato's. And then she gives us a little bit of a history of what went wrong. And so I'm going to skip directly to that part here, and then we'll take your questions.
Sounds good.
All right. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep here, X Series 170. Here we are with the Thevetat piece from Blavatsky. To continue the tradition, we have to add that this class of Hierophant was divided into two distinct categories. Those who were instructed by the sons of God of Atlantis, or who and those who were initiated in the divine doctrine of pure revelation, and others who inhabited the lost Atlantis, if such must be its name, and who, being of another race, were born with a sight embraced that embraced all hidden things and was independent of both distance and material obstacle. They were the fourth race of men mentioned in the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan sacred book, whose sight was unlimited, who knew all things at once. They were perhaps what we would now term natural-born mediums, who neither struggled nor suffered to obtain their knowledge, nor did they acquire it at any price or any sacrifice. While the former walked in the path of their divine instructors and acquired their knowledge by degrees in the mystery schools, learned at the same time to discern evil from good, the born adepts of Atlantis blindly followed the insinuations of the great and invisible dragon, King Thevetat. And it's interesting because either Blavatsky or the editor puts in parentheses the serpent of Genesis ? Thevetat had neither learned nor acquired knowledge, but to borrow an expression of Dr. Wilder in relation to the tempting serpent, he was sort of a Socrates who knew without being initiated. Thus, under the evil insinuations of their demon Thevetat, the Atlantean race became a nation of wicked black magicians. In consequence of this, war was declared, the story of which would be too long to narrate. Its substance may be found in the disfigured allegories of the race of Cain, the giants, and that of Noah and his righteous family. So she goes on to give us this whole thing about the instruction of the mystery groups of Thevetat and how they had access to all the same secrets that the advanced Amelia's group had. But what's going on is they don't have the rules, as it were. So that's where you're getting this split between the Sons of Belial and the Amelia's group. So this is her leading us down into this period where they seem to have the same abilities, but we have a clear distinction between how they use the abilities. What's interesting to me, and it's all magic oriented, of course, and it seems like whatever they can think of themselves to do, they can do. Now, Steiner talks about this group, and he said part of their problem, this is very interesting because I thought about mimes in relation to them. But basically, Steiner talked about this group, and he said, well, the dark groups in Atlantis, what they would do is whatever motion they would do, it was almost like a hypnosis thing. So they would have the lesser people in Atlantis would imitate whatever they did. So, if they put themselves in a cage, or if they imitated the action of putting themselves in a cage, the people would put themselves in a cage. If they did the action of digging a ditch, the people would dig a ditch, whatever it happened to be. So this was the kind of power that they had over them via suggestion. This is going to lead to something very important I'm going to reveal on this program, not tonight. It's coming up, though, and it's in relation to the foundations of hypnosis. This gets us into, and as I said, there were some ex-media people that were musing on some programs about Moloch recently, and I was thinking, these people are trying to figure out what has gone wrong or whatever. And if you need to, what's crucial, and I think why the mystery schools gave us the Atlantis piece, why Casey came through and gave us 900 readings on the past lives in Atlantis, is because we're facing the very same period when we had incredible access to high tech, and that this, the knowledge preceded the wisdom too dramatically, and they went over a cliff and destroyed themselves. Now they're all back. The Atlanteans are back to face this same crucible again. Now, what's interesting for me is I see people searching around on the supernatural side. They don't know quite what to make of it, especially coming out of, like I said, traditional media worlds. So we have, some of the people, even like Tucker Carlson, is being like, hey, I think those UFOs are demons. Or you're going to have to go a lot deeper than that, my friend. And um, the roots of this contained in the knowledge that's there as a foundation publicly from the mystery schools is extraordinary. And it gets us right into this story that Blavatsky is giving us and that Casey gives us with Belial and Steiner with Tau and Ahriman, that a lot of the destruction of Atlantis was based directly on their incredible talents as magicians. And, you know, you had white magicians versus black magicians going on there. That's the battle of the Amelius and Belial groups. And so we get right into the heart of it. And tonight we've seen it extends into finding these ruins in the hot zone, the esoteric knowledge of Alice in Wonderland, and the presence of these figures like T.T. Brown and Blavatsky and Casey right in the heart of all this. There's a reason for that as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, Atlantis Anno 0, Year 0, Blavatsky, and the Belial Thevetat group. Thevetat is more coming on that as well. But with all that, Miss Olivia, I've sent it your way.
Okay. All right. Let's start with this. YouTuber 427. The Caroline had a gyroscope that kept the ship from rocking. That's why they show people enjoying dinner with glassware, etc., on the dining table, showing off the stability.
Yeah.
David Termina says, speaking of gyroscopes, the most interesting aspect of the Caroline yacht itself is the enormous gyro stabilizer Johnson had installed, built by the Sperry Gyroscope Company.
Oh, yeah.
The Varian brothers were financed by the very same Sperry
Sperry,
Corporation
indeed.
years later.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because that's where the first particle accelerators that would become CERN come into, and they're portable versions. Sperry and the Varian brothers, they come right in with that. And of course, the Varian brothers coming directly out of the Theosophical Temple group that split off and went to California. And so, yeah,
that's a fantastic episode, the Varian brother episode. Do you remember which one it is?
Oh, no question. We'll revisit the Varians. But some of the information about the Varian brothers gives us that hint of how Silicon Valley is related directly to the Public Mystery School of Theosophy, which is quite dramatic. Yeah. Okay. What else you got?
Okay. YouTuber 427 again. The Caroline was fitted with a very early sonar, which they could measure not only ocean depth, but also gravity. T.T. Brown ran the technology on the yacht. Cece says, with ground penetrating radar and military bomb tech, don't we truly have the Cuba underwater city map?
Interesting. Well, here's what's interesting. So in 2000, here's how we can actually chart it. In 2000, Polina Zalitsky discovers with deep sea submersibles when she's working on a project for Castro. And remember, she originally came from Ukraine, and she, it's basically like the Soviet Union that was controlling her when she went originally to Cuba, I think in the 1960s. In fact, she defected. She got away from that terrible situation and defected to Canada. But it's years later, in 1999, when Castro knows that she's operating this underwater, because she's an ocean scientist, and he gets her to do this. And he says, I want to find Spanish galleons. Now, Castro was aware of the city off the coast, and he's getting her in to do it. At a certain point, when she finds these incredible things, and she says it's not just a pyramid or whatever, it's a whole metropolis, a city off the western tip of Cuba. Well, this is fascinating because what the word gets out so quickly. Maybe she wasn't even meant to put that on record. But what eventually happens is the Cuban Navy becomes the big block on this, and they push her out and no doubt continue the research. So they've had 20 some odd years of sifting this out. Now, flying over Western Cuba, Lester Hemingway in the 1950s after a hurricane sees the same ruins that she will discover later. T.T. Brown, when he's there with Robert Sarbarker off of Cape San Antonio there, the western tip, which is the same jump off point for Zalitsky, he's there every month, once for a month, every year before the revolution. So through the 40s and 50s, up until the Cuban Revolution, he's going over there with Saar Barker for a whole month. What are they studying? Well, what did the Navy send him into Cuba? And then bang, you have an earthquake immediately after. And by the way, it's the Navy that lends him to the Caroline and Johnson in this expedition. So this is all going on in a very stealth fashion. What you have is a city off the coast of Cuba. There's no question about it. And for me, it's the biggest scandal in archaeological history because they dropped the ball. Yes.
David Tormina again. DJ, in Johnson's bio, his son Fenimore mentioned that his father was intent on combing the ocean floor for a valuable element he called radium.
Yes.
A similar cover story to the Glomar Explorer. They were using the radium to heal cancer. Sounds like a possible reference to the two-eye stone or pieces of it that were perhaps scattered about the ocean floor. Fun fact, inside the Johnson bio, Fenimore specifically states they avoided the waters around Bimini.
Yes. Isn't that strange? I thought that was one of the weirdest parts of that whole book. And it's funny, I'm glad you brought up that book because I have some excerpts here. This was a big tip-off in that book as well. But yeah, the whole bit about what they were looking for, there's no doubt if they're doing this type of activity and they're down there, they already are aware that there are ruins down there. That's the thing. So they've had early credible reports, but as the equipment gets better, the cameras are better, the scanning is better, and they have people like Brown that they can turn to for this. I think that the detail of what they were getting became that much better, and they could really see what they were dealing with. And they may, in fact, have located one of the original storehouse 2i locations. But also interesting, when I spoke to the widow of David Zink, Zink always knew if he went certain ways out from Bimini that the compasses spin backwards. So a lot of people are aware of this. I've heard this from a number of different people, and the magnetic anomalies in the Bermuda Triangle operate in the same fashion. That's how we know that this disturbance, the 2i explosion, and what's left of it, still is operational. And they may have stationed it there in the first place because of the magnetic currents of where it is. But excellent point. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from that very same book, which is the biography of Johnson by his son, Fenn. He refers to himself as son Fenn. Now, he's talking about when Caroline docked in Miami, Florida before breakfast. She was hit with a flood of visitors. Some were friends whom the expedition members were glad to see, and some were people they could have missed seeing with pleasure. The yacht sailed at 4:30 p.m. and anchored the next morning in Nassau Harbor. Some underwater motion pictures were taken at Dr. Bart's request, but underwater motion pictures in shallow water were a dime a dozen. To Sun Fen, the time spent seemed to be wasted. The expedition sailed again the next day, and the first useful observations began with Lieutenant Townsend Brown, U.S. Navy, to put the sonic depth finder into operation. Underwater motion pictures. 1933, this is what they were doing. When you get to Hemingway going back and forth, he's also using underwater motion pictures. This is the big key. They must be seeing extraordinary things. And that's why when we get into the situation with Kennedy almost causing a national security incident to get what was in Hemingway's vault, if it's tons of footage of ruins in the hot zone, then you might do it. You're not going to do it for Ernest Hemingway's poems, regardless of how fantastic a writer and novelist that he was. And, he's unrivaled, but I don't think you're going to cause a national security incident over that. But if there's something in the vault that relates to 20, 30 years of research in the hot zone that they don't want just anybody to have, maybe the people who would get it wouldn't even understand it. That's the other interesting thing. one of the things I want to put on the record, and it's clear in the documentary and other investigations I've done, Kennedy is part of that hot zone network, in my opinion. That's why there's the strangeness around communication with Kennedy and Hemingway. And that's why when Hemingway's widow comes to the White House, Kennedy goes out on such a limb. And that's why the largest repository of information about Ernest Hemingway does not reside in some Ernest Hemingway museum. It resides in the JFK Library. Those things, the dots connect on that, and they all circulate directly back to the hot zone. And you're going to find that Kennedy, for a year, ran a submarine chasing unit off the coast of Florida. So that's a great cover as well for this type of investigation. So he's deep into it. Yes.
David Termina again. DJ, legendary British engineer and teacher Eric Laithwaite, famed for perfecting the maglev train and unceremoniously kicked out of the Royal Society of Physics for heresy, famously named his incredible presentations on the phenomenon of gyroscopic anti-gravity force the Jabberwocky.
Oh, fascinating. Right. Now, that's incredible. Well, we're seeing it has a deeper piece and a deeper significance. I found a Navy time experiment, and it's from 1918 originally, but I think a book came out about it in 1927, which I have, and they called the experiment Alice. And the there's an early inkling there about the Philadelphia experiment and the idea of, can you warp time and things of this nature. But the Alice thing, aside from just, it's fantastical, it can be used as a metaphor for that. But if you go a little bit deeper as a code name, it's quite remarkable. And it shows, I think, the level of knowledge. I'll tell you what's weird. This is a really weird one. Now, Calvin Coolidge was somebody that Ronald Reagan liked to quote. And Reagan is talking about Calvin Coolidge. And remember, Coolidge, we started the show off, he receives, through Johnson, he gets to look at the original Alice in Wonderland manuscript called Alice's Adventures Underground. And it's quite fascinating because he says, well, one of my favorite presidents is Calvin Coolidge. And then he says, but Alice would have to say that we're already in Wonderland. And it's so weird and out of place immediately that as soon as he says Coolidge, boom, right on top of it, he's talking about Alice in Wonderland. I think there's a reason why Johnson brought Alice in Wonderland to the White House. And there's another interesting thing in the bio by his son when he's talking about what he wanted to do, is he made all these facsimiles of the Alice edition and he created these plates. And then he said, I'm going to produce a new Alice book. Now, our friend Lewis Carroll was long dead. So here he is in the 1920s saying this. And in the 1930s, around 36, 37, he moves forward with this project. He has the plates, he's doing all the facsimiles of the original Alice copy, and he's making a new Alice book, whatever that's supposed to be. Well, it just so happens that he's doing it all in Germany. And as soon as the war hits, the entire thing is shut down and all those plates disappear as well, according to the Sun. And he just sort of leaves it hanging out there. So one of the other oddities of that, I think what else might be weird is that in 1903, Eldridge Johnson goes to Russia and spends all this time there on his own. And, we had okay relations with Russia in those days. It didn't get hostile until World War II, really. But still, it's an odd thing, I think, for someone in 1903 to go over and spend all this time in Russia. So that might be a kind of a link on the esoteric side. Yes.
David Termina. DJ, Eldridge supposedly suffered from periods of great melancholy. Was he under similar psychic attack as Blavatsky, or was it apothecum overuse syndrome? And Roger Z says Blavatsky's imprisonment is written of in Steiner's book, The Occult Movement of the 19th Century.
Well, that's true. That's a fantastic book. I have it right here. That's the one he's talking about. This is an extraordinary book. But remember that Steiner is citing C.G. Harrison. Steiner, in fact, doesn't write anything about it. He quotes, which is very interesting. And C.G. Harrison wrote it in 1896, which is 7 years before Steiner even got on to Theosophy. So there's something very strange about C.G. Harrison's book, and I've tried to put that on the record here. The imprisonment, as described, was something so rare that none of the schools would ever, even the left-hand path schools. And it's interesting because that whole thing about right and left on the politics side is apparently mirrored in the mystery centers. Since you brought that up, I actually do want to read the quote. I just found it. And it is the actual quote of Harrison's. And Harrison's book is 5 lectures, but I think it's only like 120 pages or something. And he's doing it for the Berrien Society. Okay, nobody knows who they are. And nobody knows who he is. There was some suggestion that this was a youthful version of Steiner, but no, apparently not, because Steiner hadn't in 1896 moved into this. This could be somebody who became a mentor for Steiner, but something very, very strange about C.G. Harrison. It's like he knows exactly what's going on. And the 8th sphere is in there. This is a decade before it's mentioned by Steiner, but it's a decade after it's mentioned by Sinnott. By the way, it's Esoteric Buddhism is the book that Lewis Carroll carries around with him. But anyway, this is C.G. Harrison, Transcendental Universe. Okay, it's page 36 of the book. What is occult imprisonment and why was it inflicted on Madame Blavatsky? There is certain operation of ceremonial magic by means of which a wall of psychic influences may be built up around an individual who's become dangerous, which has the effect of paralyzing the higher activities and producing what is called a repercussion of effort. And the result is a kind of spiritual sleep characterized by fantastic visions. It is an operation seldom resorted to even by brothers of the left. Even the black magic guys don't do this. And in the case of Madame Blavatsky, was disapproved of by almost all European occultists. On the American brotherhoods alone rests the responsibility for what has since happened. So the whole rerouting of the Theosophical Society from its original destiny, etc., is all because the American schools were worried about what Blavatsky was going to let out, as it were. That's an important thing for us to keep in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Atlantis Anno 0, Blavatsky versus the Belial Thevetat group. We're going deep here tonight. You've got Alice in Wonderland, T.T. Brown, and Eldridge Johnson in the hot zone. And remember, Eldridge Johnson, who basically the whole RCA poster boy, he created this incredible craze around records and record companies and selling records, and really got the technology through the gramophone and what became sort of, the technology boom of the early 20th century. This is the same character who's funding the operation to go into Piedras Negras and find Casey's Hall of Records. And so we have these figures all working together. We know we're in deep, deep territory. And I was mentioning when we started the show, this all branches off of the May 3rd documentary that we did with all the new research plus the foundational HOTZONE research. And that is Hacking Atlantis. It's free and available on this channel. The CRAZE in the HOTZONE. Gotten tremendous feedback from people about this thing. And we put a lot of the focused information in there. Share it far and wide, and make sure that people know, because more information about the HOTZONE is coming forward. All right, Miss Olivia, we'll take 2 more questions.
2 more? Are you kidding? I got such great questions.
All right, go for it.
Okay. Lisa Whaler, was the Belial group dark magicians from Mars? Did they destroy their own planet and come to this one? And Rotten Crypto Bits, did Blavatsky influence the Belial way?
I think that she was at war with these groups, which are, I think that if you term them Ahrimanic or Belial, you're getting it right. The Maxwell types were after the Belial cult, right? So they were after reanimating this Belial thing there in the HOTZONE. So I would look at it that way. I think that's the best way for us to think about it. And Belial becomes then the group in Atlantis that gets the upper hand by imitating. This is something that Casey refers to often with Belial, is they imitate the Emilius group. So the Emilius group has all this creativity, and they're using spiritual technology and all the rest. And what the Belial group is imitative. And they use the magic that they discover through the Emilius group to create this shadowy kind of black magic country. And the battle between those two groups, as Casey goes into it, and this is a lot deeper than Moloch or the things that we hear about, is the battle between the two. This is the clash, and it destroys the entire continent of Atlantis. First, it splits it into 3 islands. Then there are massive wars in relation to it. And finally, the Belial group wins, but everything goes down. And the Law of One Children of Emilius group goes to different centers and hides the information. Remember Casey's story. It's 33 tablets is one of the things that's in the Hall of Records, giving a record of the whole thing. Then information about the construction of the Two-Eye Stone, and then all this other stuff. One of them is in a pyramid, which is between the Sphinx and the river. And one is off the coast of Bimini, and the third one is in the Yucatan, which I think is directly in Piedras Negras. And I think some people from the ARE have done some investigating as much as they could on this. And there's good foundational information to say that. What I found out was that the whole bit about the paw stone and the paw as the steganography for these initiates storing the records, that's going to be explosive as more comes out, because you had sphinxes over here in Yucatan in America. So, if you have them as part of the tradition, then if they're hiding them in the Yucatan with the Sphinx, and they're hiding them in Egypt with the Sphinx, chances are where the Bimini Road is, you're going to find something that's like a Sphinx. Yes.
David Termina, wow, amazing episode. One more.
Yeah.
DJ, the individual who rises as the chief coordinator of Eldridge Johnson's scientific donations was Detlev Bronk, a man said to be part of the original Majestic 12.
Oh, fascinating. Well, his connections, that is really interesting. Johnson's connections, if we really get into it, he being one of the richest men in the world, plus he's dialed in very early on. He's there with Edison, he has access. And so this is somebody, if he's going to find advanced technology, it's obviously some kind of obsession. Look at the obsession around Alice. So he's somebody who's in the know. And I think the presence of Brown on the boat immediately is the big tip off, and that he was able to get him loaned while he's still a lieutenant in the Navy. But the MJ12 thing, whew, yeah, that's really, that's getting to it if you want to know. I mentioned this before, but David Tormina has great open source research and things that he does on Twitter, and he gets into a lot of the good details around this. Those are fantastic questions.
Outstanding researcher. Okay, can I ask you, this is my question. So since we seem to be reliving this kind of, Belial Law of One experience all over again, did Casey ever say what the Law of One group could have done but did not do in order to succeed over Belial that we could do now?
Yeah.
As far as
I think the
organizing?
The only thing that's interesting to me and that comes up in the various life readings that Casey gives on this, and it's very interesting because the way he talks about it, he goes personal with the person who's having the reading, and he says, look, when you were in Atlantis, you were part of the Amelius group, but you were attracted to someone who was in the Belial, one of the sons of Belial. And this caused an incredible problem with your family. It caused problems with you. And eventually what happened is, you married this person who was part of the Belial group, and it ruined, your life basically. So there's a lot of that. Whatever was going on with the Belial group, they had incredible magnetism, and they studied ways to draw people away. But I find it interesting when Casey is talking about it, he talks to them individually. He never says, well, all the whole Amelius group did this. He just, in certain specific instances, he talks about how people kind of abandoned their core ethics and went with this other might makes right group. And you could probably see that as a reanimation, say during the Nazi type thing, or in any kind of fascist regime where a group is taking over, is very magnetic and using, in the case of the Nazis, they had such high-end knowledge of occult. They could have never done the whole thing without the occult knowledge, but it ended up being their undoing as well. So I think there are other readings where Casey is looking around and he says, look at all the world leaders right now. You can see all of them are reincarnated Atlanteans. That's interesting. Also, he seems to indicate that the people who are Atlanteans are different. He also doesn't indicate that there's that many of them. I find all of that very interesting. So I hope that at least answers your question.
Yeah, actually, I want to follow up on that with the Amelius group. Is there anything would discipline have helped? I'm just thinking where what you're describing is sort of lust in the largest sense. And I'm thinking about pop culture, music, Hollywood, that it's, people have no spiritual discipline nowadays. And, they need to kind of detoxify their vessel and have spiritual practices and, eat clean and meditate and sort of, so.
Well, I mean, if you think about the whole thing that Casey gave, right, he has a whole dietary outline, which, he has a 80% alkaline, 20% acid diet, keeps the body. He created such a renaissance for osteopathy and chiropractic, saying that, basically, the majority of ills of the human race are because of these spinal impingements and the circulation problems that result. It's quite interesting. I think Casey is giving that blueprint there, physical, mental, and spiritual. So the Casey work is all about mind as the builder. So this is where he's coming from with it. And I think if you were to go deeper with it, there's a kind of a faith issue. But in terms of people taking a lesson from it now, all of the schools, the Casey work, theosophy, anthroposophy, there's tremendous materials for work on oneself, and which is the core of it all. And by the way, none of them would approve of the kind of rancor of the social media thing where people think they're getting a lot of things done by yelling at in the timeline of some figure that they don't like. That's not, I mean, once in a while, I guess it's quite merited, but that's kind of a waste of energy in the grand scheme of things. One of the things I love about the Gurdjieff work is the incredible emphasis on not losing energy through over-identification. And I think, oddly enough, the Gurdjieff work is uniquely suited for a lot of 21st century problems. There's a lot of things about focus there. There's a lot of things about being present. And there's also the whole understanding about the kind of brainwashing that takes place in society. So yeah, it's quite remarkable.
Actually, what you're describing, it's so simple that people just sort of procrastinate and they don't do it because it's not exotic and because it does require, it's just, the more you meditate, the more you clean up it's about, you choose one or the other. You either spiral down or you spiral up. Spiraling up takes way more energy. We have gravity here on this planet. We spiral down naturally if you don't use any muscles,
I think that's true. Well, in the Gurdjieff work, he says that you'll progress anyway. The problem is the evolutionary track of your progression. If you don't kind of interfere and increase it, it will take such a long time for you to do it that having a spiritual practice or having a focus is dramatic. And it's funny too, because I hear this is going to be the fascinating thing. Just like right now, you hear the freakiest thing, like men should be in women's sports, and the whole thing that they're doing, amping up the trans thing, not in a way that it would naturally happen, but in this contentious way to set off everyone against everyone. It's very interesting because you can see after a while of doing this, they will revert to what I call almost like an Ayatollah complex. And the super conservative thing could come in because of the pendulum swing. And this is the problem. It's like all these extremes that happen and take place. And you could see a very heavy kind of Ayatollah surge. And I already hear little bits and pieces of it. And I got to tell you, I don't want to have spirituality laid out by media companies or podcasters who've found the light, Glenn Beck or something. I mean, these are people who are in a position of giving you information. And I think that there's a lot of chicanery going on. I called it out with Candace Owens. I called it out with Russell Brand. There's a false layer of religiosity being painted on top of this stuff because they've looked at the numbers and think they can increase their audience that way. So we have to be very aware of, just like back in the day, they had Jerry Falwell, and this is, he said all the right things, right? But he was a total phony. You got to be aware of, Joel Osteen or something. So understanding the mystery traditions or understanding the kind of ethics around the spiritual aspect is crucial, and not being a sucker for the next wave that comes in, I've found Jesus on my podcast. Look, it's great when people find Jesus, but really, you can also see the manipulation involved with it. So,
potential
I think,
manipulation.
No question. I think the majority of it, yes. All right, fantastic. I'm going to read something, and then we're going to wrap up the show. How are you doing out there?
Doing great.
Excellent. I thought this was interesting, and again, it comes to us from the. This is something that I read at the end of the last show, but I think this is going to be important. And by the way, with the thing that I just said, it's not to develop in too much of a cynicism with, the things that are happening in the world. I don't think cynicism gets us anywhere. It's just to have a good, healthy filter about which way the superstructure is moving. And the superstructure sometimes includes marketing around religion because they try to manipulate Christians, and I think by and large, people who are into their Christian faith, they already have a good understanding of this. But I've noticed it's been happening, so I thought I would point that out. So I was talking about Hepsut, and I want to end this episode again with a quote about Hepsut and how his name meant help to keep shut in relation to the Hall of Records. So he's describing the past life of this individual, and he says, before this, we find this is a 56-year-old executive. Before this, we find the entity was in that land known as the Egyptian during those periods when turmoils and strifes arose. The entity was among those that were called in from that land known as the Atlantean to act as a mediator between the natives and the king and the priest at the time. The entity was among those that were banished with the priest, yet remained true to those tenets that were brought during those sojourns, returning with the priest and aiding in the reestablishing of the Temple Beautiful and the Temple of Records. Now, again, the Hall of Records, he actually refers to it as the Temple of Records more, or the Pyramid of Records. And the beginnings and the distribution of the tenets or aids that were giving out to others in the name Hepsut. In the experience the entity gained, for he was among those that later became the supervisor of the building of the pyramids, that is the mystery as yet not discovered today. That's the Pyramid of Records, and that's the one that exists between the Sphinx and the river. And Hepsut helped to keep the two-eye shut and the information and the knowledge about it. So, we find ourselves in an interesting position, I think, in relation to this, because it's definitely there in our consciousness that something took place like what we're seeing happening now. And so when we get around, there's actual locations involved, which is helpful. But then there's an understanding that part of it operates on a metaphysical basis, and that the function of it takes place in a realm that isn't necessarily physical. So influence and one of the things that came up about Eldridge Johnson and how he suffered all this depression when he was on these Atlantean search missions and things, I think it is interesting, because I think whether it's occult groups, kind of like the opposite of the Orphic Circle type group, but who get together for a purpose, can definitely sway. And I remember sway circumstances, individuals, and their health and their lifestyle. What I found interesting is Steiner was talking about if he could come out and say something in relation to the eighth sphere beyond what he was saying. And he said if he were to, then he would be hit by so much psychic attack at the same time that all the schools would unite basically against him for making this announcement. So there's an acknowledgement there that you are in a situation where it's almost like an astral shield is required to get to the truth around these things. And that if you get closer to the truth, it's probably very easy to send you a wave of depression. And I don't think it just happens randomly. I think that people would have to be aware of you and what you were doing. I don't think it's just something that happens out of the blue, but certainly it's a good point, because I think that we've seen it exercised with different people. And I've talked to people who've done it, or who've had it happen to them. And I think in relation to the work that I do, it's only happened on a couple of occasions, but they're very noteworthy for that very reason. So there's no question you need some kind of psychic self-defense when it comes to these things. And so I hope that answers that.
Yeah.
Yes.
The other thing is you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are systems.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us, I know myself included, I've never been a joiner. I've decided that
Oh,
that's
yeah.
not serving me anymore. I need to commit to a path and to practices, and that's going to be very
Interesting.
supportive at this time.
Wow. Well, I think that there are, you know, it's interesting because this is a Gurdjieff thing again, which is that the most work can happen in groups, but he recommended small groups. And he also, when he talked about work on oneself individually, he talked about how it would help, so when you work individually, it helps your magnetic center generally. So you're always working in a positive direction, whether you're working with a group or not. But there's something about a group that gives you access to more interaction, energy. It's like the ideas room. There's so many ideas that are flowing that it increases my own knowledge base as well. But what's also interesting about that is, and this is going to come up in an episode I'm doing on hypnosis, it's about the interaction between individuals. And it's not just about yelling about circumstances that are going on in the world. And certainly there's so much to latch onto that you can't just stand aside with what's going on in the world, right? Before you know it, they'll change the Constitution in the blink of an eye. So you have to be engaged, but there's a way to be engaged, and it's not to be over-identified or just overly negative towards everything that's happening in the world. That's a dangerous state to be in. And I'll close tonight with a shot of the hero who wrote Alice in Wonderland, who is kind of a mixed bag, but he is a very interesting person, and he pulled off something extraordinary, weaving in his tale of this esoteric mystery of Alice. And I have to say, I think of Alice in Wonderland as schoolwork, and for the times that I've read it, I still don't feel that I could ever say I understand it completely. I think that it opens up on a regular basis, and to impact that many people in that fashion with esoteric information. Wow. And of course, his master's voice, Eldridge Johnson, he came from a very interesting, humble background, and gave us maybe some of the most amazing technology of its period. And then, strangely enough, got very, very deep into the search in the hot zone, a secret search in the hot zone. And they had the cover of these Smithsonian pieces. There's going to be more uncovered in relation to this. If I'm right, I'm going to be able to release something kind of major about this summer. And of course, in the meantime, Hacking Atlantis and the Craze in the Hot Zone documentary is there for you. Here's the actual quote about Carroll asking his publisher at Macmillan. He says, "Have you any means, or can you find any, of printing a page or two in the next volume of Alice in reverse?" So he's the first backmasker, as it were. And it may be that Carroll was wanting to do the whole poem in mirror writing. Macmillan responded that it would cost a great deal more to do, and they were trying to dissuade him. And apparently that's what happened. So he said, at the preface to The Hunting of the Snark, Carroll wrote, "Let me take the opportunity of answering a question that has often been asked me, how to pronounce Slithy Toves, Slithytoves. The I in Slithy is long, as in writhe, and Toves is pronounced so as to rhyme with groves. Again, the first O in Borogoves is pronounced like the O in borrow. I've heard people try and give it the sound of O in worry. Such is human perversity." This is somebody who took time on it. Most unusual. And he would find maybe the biggest fan of all in one Eldridge Johnson. Fascinating. And with that, Miss Olivia, that is our show for this evening.
All right. I got a bunch of super chats to thank. Give me 1 second to line those up. Okay.
Yes.
Short Order Cook 1, Global Atlantis, Fulcanelli, Jennifer Walters, Corey Cartier, Descat Brock, Greedy Cat, Vincent Tomlinson, Jay Parsons, Keith Baker, Critiquing Christianity, St. John Penuel Chidester III.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. Whoa.
Fantastic name.
Carol Andrews, C.A. Beverforden, Robin Landry, Eurythmia's Fun, YouTuber 427, and David John Moan, and Jessica Rodriguez. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Excellent. Wow. We really appreciate your support. And to all our subscribers, thank you. You help us to do the work that we're doing, and we're in your debt, and hopefully provide you with these great stories going forward. Thank you for getting behind the work that we do. And also remember, if you are new, to go and sign up for our free newsletter to keep us in touch and to support our efforts here on this show. I love that shot of the technology. And, there's so much that they try to take down this image and say, oh, it was two different hieroglyphs or whatever. Look, that thing sat behind a wall for 2,000 years. All right. It looks like a helicopter, a submarine, and something else. So, the hints to the technology are certainly there. And, we've pointed out the very fascinating.
Right. Luke Speeder.
What's
right?
that?
Luke's.
Oh,
Speeder.
yeah. Yeah. It's
totally.
quite incredible if you think about it. And of course, direct from Clarence Bloomfield himself, whose mother was the great funder of Keeley and Tesla, who was also in Philadelphia, as we recall. So we have these hints there, and certainly we've seen it operate right directly in the hot zone. I'm going to do some shout outs here before we go. And of course, the family secrets also involved, very, very deep in the Hemingway family. Let's see here. Who we got out here? Fantastic. Keith Baker, Happy Hermit, Alchemy by Angels. Thank you, DJ and Olivia. Great show. Thank you. It's great to have you here. Let's see. Corky Goss, Golden Girl. Jessica Rodriguez. I love these Friday night shows. Thank you for always making an amazing show with all the information you bring us to tell us the truth when others want to hide it or cover it up. I know it's extraordinary, isn't it? Thank you for being here. Couldn't do it without the ideas room. Short Order Cook, Rebel Alliance. Great show, DJ and Miss Olivia. Bravo, Miss Olivia. Nicely done. Calistoga Refried. New. Najat Madre. History lives and the truth always comes out. Well, this is the thing, and why it cracks me up that we have junk conspiracy where people just make stuff up. The true stuff is so fascinating and blows your mind. I mean, Alice in Wonderland and Atlantis, you couldn't make up a better story than that. So it's there, and it's fine to have a good imagination, but let's see. What is the pick at the end? That is in the Hot Zone documentary. It's something we pointed out from the finding of Clarence Bloomfield. And I found that in a book in 2017. And I couldn't believe it had not been picked up on before. But I believe it is the different emblems left over now of the two-eye stone, the later memory of the Firestones. Beatles did the first backwards stuff. That's true. Absolutely. Fantastic show. Amy Thomas, Nina says. Another brilliant presentation of video and chat. Thank you very much, Nina. Great to have so many of you there. I know Kate's out there. Lakita.
Can you give a special shout out to Ruby Adore, who says, I've been watching since first X show.
Holy Ruby Adore. Well, I was going to say we adore you, but that's thank you for being here with us. And I'm trying to think of what the first X series show must be. I'll have to go back and see what that was. But it's all incredible to look back at now, let me tell you. I've been watching since the first show. There it is, Ruby Adore. Fascinating. It is up there still. I know that. And it's interesting because someone asked me, they said, well, do I have it wrong when you said X Series 170 is coming up, but the X Series playlist has 245 videos in it? And so I responded to them and said, It's 170 actual shows, and I do supplementary shows in between to support or kind of they're not quite a full X series show. So there's 75 of those. So in fact, in that playlist, you have almost 250 videos of X series episodes. That's quite remarkable. And of course, the documentary, the Craze in the Hot Zone, Hacking Atlantis documentary, brings it all together with a very great production value. And I do the interviews for those with Kelsey. That they're really the team that works on those is quite extraordinary. The Truth Will Set You Free, Traveling Riverside, Blues Johnson, indeed. Michael Horton and Roger Z. Great. Wow, that's a lot of videos. I would definitely agree, Czar Illuminations. Keith Baker, fantastic. We will be back with you next week, and we have some exciting shows coming up for you. Some great interviews in June. And Nixon in the Time Capsule is the first show, I think. Wow. Robert Merritt makes history, and it's still hanging out there. DJ and Olivia make Fridays great. Roosevelt Media. It's great to see you, sir. We'll see you all next week. And, it says end broadcast, but after all,
Never really ends.
It never really ends. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and there could be again. And it maybe not even political. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
God bless.
Have a great night and a great weekend.